Hi, everybody. On this episode of The Process, we talk with my friend and Skybound executive editor, Ben Abernathy. Ben and I first met at Wildstorm. We worked on projects like The Authority, Team 7, and Stormwatch PhD. We then continued at DC Comics, where we worked on Detective Comics and Batman Offworld. Now he and I are working together at Skybound's Energon universe with G.I. Joe and Transformers. As we talk, we'll be watching my rendering of Doug Mahnke's cover to Skybound's Transformers. And with that, please welcome, as always, producer Mike and our special guest, Ben Abernathy.
What's up, gentlemen?
Oh, guys, it's good to see you. Thank you for having me on. Mike, Dave, it's great. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for being here, Ben. You and I have known each other for close to 25 years from our days at Wildstorm. We've always had a good friendship, a good working relationship. I love talking to you at shows, on the phone, in person, online like this. So thank you so much for coming on. This is your first YouTube experience.
It is. So please be patient with me, forgive me, and I'm just excited to talk comics. It's insane. We've known each other almost half of our lives.
Over half my life. It's one of those weird things about starting so young that, like John Nee has been, John Nee, for those, he was our president at Wildstorm. Yep. I worked with him again at Cryptozoic Entertainment, and obviously he's at DC Comics, and I've known him
Marvel for a bit.
Yeah, Marvel for a bit. I've known him for almost all my life. I mean, it's such a weird thing. Tell me a little bit about your background. Let's talk about Ben. Introduce yourself a little bit, like how you started in comics, what got you into even thinking about comics, and let's just go from there.
All right. So the origin story, we'll keep it here pretty quick because I've been asked this a number of times over the years, like, how did you get into the comic book business? How did you find out about publishing? And honestly, to ruin people's impressions of me, I was not a huge comic book reader as a kid. The comics I tended to read, like the first comics I would read were like Tintin or Uncle Scrooge, things along those lines that my grandma had had. I grew up in a small town in Central Oregon, and we had one comic book shop. And my older brother was the huge comic fan. He would buy anything Frank Miller did. He was all Daredevil, The Incredible Hulk. And so I got into comic reading, like sort of American publishing big two, through him. And I remember he gave me a comic by Frank Miller and Dave Gibbons called Give Me Liberty, which was the start of the Martha Washington saga at Dark Horse Comics. I remember as a kid, we were like, oh, weird. There's a publisher in Milwaukee, Oregon. We were like, where's Milwaukee at? Had never heard of it. And so fast forward to when I'm in college in Portland, Oregon. And this summer of my junior year, like approaching the summer of my junior year, I come upon the Dark Horse offices in Milwaukee, Oregon, which I discovered was a suburb of Portland. And on a fluke, I decided to call them up and ask them if they offered internships, because I didn't have an internship lined up. I didn't really want to work in a restaurant for another summer. And long story short, they brought me on as their first editorial intern in 1996. So yes, I'm very old, or
you were very
aging like a fine wine. So I was an editorial intern. And then as I finished my degree, they hired me in January of 98 as an assistant editor. And honestly, it was sort of like just a job I got out of college. I was a history major. And so in my mind, I thought I'd go to grad school and end up teaching high school history somewhere.
That's what you thought. You'd be a high school teacher, like history teacher. That was kind of the plan until this internship.
Right. Okay. Exactly. Because with a history degree, I mean, kind of like, what else do you really pursue?
What do you do?
Right.
Unless you're Indiana Jones, right? Something like that, where you try to discover things. But I guess that's a different profession.
Yeah, he was a teacher, but he was like archaeology. But yeah, so then, that sort of, I worked at Dark Horse for about a year and a half, and sort of one thing led to another. And, we don't need to go through my entire resume, but I ended up moving to New York City for 2.5 years. And I got a job at DC where I worked for about a year. And that's where I connected with Wildstorm. So I was sort of the liaison because, as you know, Wildstorm was purchased by DC at the end of 1998, I believe. And so, 6 months into 1999, they realized they needed somebody in the offices to help traffic all of the books that were being published and sort of deal with, have a boots on the ground in the New York offices. And so that ended up being part of my job. And then I was like doing creative services work, and that led to a job at Marvel, which then led to a job at Wildstorm, where we first met in 2002. And then, I was part of the group that moved when Wildstorm was shuttered, moved up to Burbank.
The Burbank.
Worked in the digital space for a while, came back to DC, and now I'm at Skybound. And I'm still just this job out of college, like 27 years later or whatever. It's still just
right.
Like,
and it feels like a blink of an eye. I mean, it goes by quick. It's really crazy. Do you remember your first book that you edited?
The first book that I edited,
because it's Dark Horse. I mean, we all know it's a huge Hellboy, publisher. At least that's what they're so well known for.
Yeah, as assistant editor, I think my first credit was in Dark Horse Presents.
Okay.
Probably, I don't remember what issue, early 100s maybe. So when I was very fortunate in my time at Dark Horse as well, because I did work on Hellboy. I worked on Usagi Jimbo. I worked on Sid and City, Hell and Back. I worked on 300. I was the assistant editor on just about every creatorial book in that period. In fact, at one point I was the only assistant editor to the entire Dark Horse.
How cool is that? I mean, those are some big projects. And with that, this is why I have you on. So each show, like I said before I had you on, is we try to have a topic, and this topic is talking about editors, editorial, how it affects comic books. The hot take or the tagline for the show is who really calls the shots. Because in my opinion, it's always the editor. Sure, we get the independence where the writer kind of is the editor, even if they bring in someone to project manage. But those are more creator owns. Even when you get some big names like Scott Snyder or Jeff Lemire or Mark Waid at DC, those editors are still huge. Obviously, you got Robert Kirkman, who was his own editor for Walking Dead and Invincibles, if I am correct in that. Or at least overall on the creative side. But you've edited some major projects from a very early age. And so we're going to talk about that, if that's okay, about just kind of the difference. So my first topic is the evolution of the editorial role. We want to kind of talk just briefly about the responsibilities that you had back at Dark Horse, how it kind of transitioned through the different companies, and how you're kind of doing it as executive editor at Skybound. So it's one of those things. How has it shifted in terms of your actual responsibilities to craft the book?
That's a great question. And I feel like I'm going to give you a wrong answer. No, I'm just
no wrong answers here. No wrong answers.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I love talking about editing and the process, but it's also interesting in that, I do not believe there's any accredited college or university that you can get a comic book editing degree, or that, like I know there's, various courses you can take and stuff. But so, when I started in the business, and I think to this day too, it very much is you learn to a degree on the job, and you learn like the habits and, the sort of philosophies from the editors, the senior editors, the senior staff. And, that helps influence, your own opinions or your own viewpoints, but it also, I think, can help mold you as an employee as well. I was very lucky at Dark Horse. I've often joked I'm like the Forrest Gump of comics, because I feel like, I've been so fortunate in every opportunity I've had to sort of be the right place at the right time. So when I was at Dark Horse, like I mentioned, I was the assistant editor for every editor in the group at one point. And it was awesome and it's thrilling and like one of the best jobs I've ever had. But it's also very interesting to see the different types of editorial style. I would say, and this probably applies more directly to DC or Marvel in a lot of ways too. Like you mentioned, like there was a point, probably toward the tail end of the 90s, early 90s, where the editors were ran the show. They dictated,
in a very hardcore way, my way or the highway. They all were very protective of their properties, their bullpen of artists, their bullpen. Like I was a huge Mike Carlin guy. I worked on a ton of books with him. Yeah. What's up, Mike?
Just real quick. Who tells the editor, who gives the editor directions or prompts or whatever? Like what direction does the editor give?
Who tells us what to do? Nobody. Yeah. No, I'm just kidding. It depends. Actually, honestly, it depends on the, typically it's the editor in chief, or in some cases it'll be the group editor and the executive editor.
Publisher, possibly.
Or a publisher, correct.
Right.
I mean, there's
Depending
like a
on what
chain of command, you know, and it's roughly been the same sort of everywhere I've gone. So in this case, Sean Makowitz, who is our publisher, our SVP publisher and editor-in-chief is my boss. But I, you know, and I, you know, at one point, Dan DiDio and Bob Harris were my bosses at DC, and Canals, John Nee, et cetera, at Wildstorm. But yeah, there was sort of like a, my way or the highway, like you were saying, Dave, you know, or like, I hate to say an iron fist, but it was sort of, they ran their groups and they dictated what they wanted it to be. They were like fierce to keep their talent. And obviously there's a huge rivalry between, say, Marvel and DC. And, but I, you know, we don't need to wax philosophical about how the comics changed in the 90s, but as creators, the top creators from Marvel all started Image. They wanted to do their own material. They wanted to like
have more control than the editor.
Correct. Yeah. And so, you know, I think that, you know, I ran the Batman, the Gotham group, the Batman group at DC for a number of years. And I'm not an iron fisted sort of person at all. I've always believed in collaboration, and a part of this, I think, is probably my personality, but also I think for what I felt were the best or the most successful projects I was on at a young age at Dark Horse. And so, you know, I do believe too that, like, you know, the editorial process, and I think it should change, like it should evolve, but every project's different and it requires different sort of hats. I don't have any gimmick hats.
No props here.
You know,
it's interesting because the way I look at it from when I was a young kid, with the editors that would work with like Mike Carlin and you know, some others, and even when, you know, Dan DiDio or Paul Lovitz, you know, we're still kind of running the show at DC. Wildstorm was its whole beast, you know, of the Wild West when I was working with John Layman as editorial and you know, Scott Doombier on America's Best Comics and all these different things. Like it was a whole nother beast on that. But one thing that I've noticed, especially at DC, was, and I heard Marvel was the same way, was every editor, and this is how you started, has assistant editors. And so you would spend a good chunk of time as an assistant editor before you became editor, or now there seems like there's associate editors and, you know, like all these other extra little steps. And I feel like in today's world, an editor kind of gets promoted really quickly. A lot of turnover, a lot of poaching, a lot of movement. Where back in the day, you mentioned it, where it was like you had DC and then you had Marvel editors. You didn't have a lot of, you know, crossing. Where, you know, we have Mike Martz, one of my favorite editors. He's been at DC Comics, well, Marvel, then DC, then Aftershock, and now he's at Mad Cave.
Right.
And who knows if there's other little stops, you know, in there. You know, so there's like a lot of movement for a major, you know, editor. Most of my editors at Valiant have all came and gone from other places. A lot of my, you know, DC editors were, you know, just not too long ago, you know, associate editors or assistant editors. And so it seems like that's another just dynamic, you know, that has shifted in the editorial, that you don't have these long-standing roles of learning from, you know, an editor who's been doing it for 20 years. You're now learning from an editor who's maybe done it 3 years or 2 years.
Right. Yeah. Or even less. I mean, you're right. I mean, I think part of that is the volatility, we've seen in the publishing industry, say over the last 10 years, you know, the sort of ebbs and like, you know, flow of like companies like Marvel and DC, when they have layoffs or contractions or, you know, market reactions and stuff. But you're right. You know, when I had started way back, you know, last millennium, it was, you know, you had to wait your turn basically because editors would never leave. You know, you look at somebody like Mike Carlin or Tom Brevoort, who were in a lot of ways the sort of like, you know, Marvel and DC versions of each other that never left. Oh, they spent their entire life. Well, I guess Mike was at Marvel and jumped over, but it's like you spend 20 or 30 years.
Right.
But so there's not a lot of upward mobility. When I was at DC, you know, by, I don't know, mid 2000, it was very clear that I was never going to go advance anywhere within the company.
Right. I mean, back then, Dan Raspler was still, you know, strong of, you know, the Justice League or JLA, how it was called back then. Mike Carlin was still strong. I mean, you had you had, and Vertigo was still, you know, a major player. So you had it's very hard to kind of break in. And now you're right. It seems like it goes that much more. Do you think that's also because creators now with the creator-owned boom and not the original Image comics, but just how easy it is to create your own material now. Do you think that has changed the power dynamic between editor, publisher, and creator? Do you think the creators have a little bit more say in what they do? I mean, and I'll expand on another question later on my response to that. But what do you think?
Definitely. I think that's definitely, an element to it for sure. We had obviously the start of the Image era was the sort of emergence of sort of rock star creators who could sort of write their own ticket or dictate basically anything they wanted.
Yeah, the British Invasion as well. Those, Alan Moore was a pretty quick rock star.
Yep, exactly. And you see a lot of those like early Vertigo creators too that had sort of come in and sort of had that sort of same level of success. But it's also, while there are a lot of bigger name creators or like, high value targets, as we call them. No, I'm just kidding. We do not. But there's also a constant influx of new creators, that are coming in from whether, there was the period where television and like film or video game writers, there was a lot of influx on that side.
Let me, my next question actually piggybacks off that of why there's new creators, because one of the biggest difference of editorial, when I used to get my pages from Mike at DC or even at Wildstorm, we would get the hard boards, 11x17 art boards. We would scan them in ourselves. So we'd get a FedEx package and we'd do everything ourselves. Then it switched to zip discs, where they would DC or Wildstorm would scan it and then ship out FedEx, the zip disc. So we'd have the digital files. And now we use Dropbox. Back when you were at Dark Horse, it was still the FedEx times. It was still hard. Everything was hard copies. We'd send in discs for you guys to have to get the colorings, the color files. Email, Dropbox, all that has changed the editorial world greatly. And that's, so much so that, our late friend Carl Mostert, who passed away, last year, you found him in South Africa at Cape Town during a Comic-Con. How has the digital part of editorial changed in terms of the way you make your books? I mean, I know I just talked about we move files, but how else has it changed for you?
It's interesting. You're right. I mean, when I started, it was all manual, traditional. Like I was as an intern, my job was to get all the incoming FedEx, art, log it all in, make photocopies, deliver it to the editors or move it to the production artists and stuff. And like production artists then were people that were trained at the Kubert School or whatever to letter, to ink, that can sort of handle all the corrections on the boards themselves. Because we also lettered on the boards. We were not doing digital lettering at the time. And so there was a skill set involved there. And, I think, it's just sort of like the advancement in technology has sort of made access, like in particularly internationally, you bring up, Carl, our ability to interact with creators, internationally. You've got obviously email becomes the sort of greatest tool. It used to be the telephone, but an email becomes a way to sort of balance out high volume, material. You've got Google Translate so that people who cannot speak any English can speak fairly fluent English and contact you, by email. Like you said, the sort of rise of FTP type technology, Dropbox or WeTransfer, etc., has sort of. I doubt it's taken a huge chunk out of the business for FedEx or Airborne or whatever, but there was a point at DC when toward the end of my tenure in the back group, someone was like, "Can I send in the boards?" I'm like, "I don't even know if we have a FedEx number anymore to like send boards in."
Send something. So when we talk about new digital tools, so like for artists, the digital, there's so many more digital artists out there that are now inking themselves because they're all just working on a tablet. Obviously, all of coloring's digital, all of lettering's digital, design's digital, everything's digital. Adding tools. Is there anything digitally that you've added to your skill set to help you edit a book? Like such example, like when you need to read a script, are you selecting all and letting it, are you having an audible of a script or is there anything like that?
I guess maybe I'm not the most technically savvy editor that you'll ever interview on the show, but really it's sort of like the Microsoft suite, Adobe suite is like the kind of stuff that we use predominantly. Like when I read scripts, I tend to read them in a PDF format so that I can use a pen tool and mark them up, because when I started in comics, you print out the script and you would get your red pen and you would write it. So then I just do that literally digitally now.
Same with lettering changes, right? It's all on a PDF, make a little note.
Correct. And when I do balloon guides, so the editors will take the script, compare it, to typically the black and white art, and then the editor would literally draw on the art to dictate where to the letter or where.
Are you still so balloon guides? Because Mike's going to chime in on this one. I know he's going to have this question. What's a balloon guide?
You were you were so psychic.
Yeah, I'm getting it because I get that. I actually get this question a lot, because especially from creator owns, and because I've been working with a lot of letterers. How often first of all, a balloon guide is when the editor draws where he wants the letterer to make the balloons. So here's box 1, box 2, things like that. So Ben, the question for you would be then, how often do you still do that on your books? You're editing Transformers. Are you still doing balloon guides?
Yep. Transformers, G.I. Joe, Void Rivals every month. I do balloon placements, balloon guides for every single issue for Russ Wooten to work from.
And Russ, so we'll bring up Russ. Russ is talented. He's an amazing letterer. Why? Why do you do the balloon guides? Is it to help speed him up? Is it to help limit corrections? Or is it just something that you don't want to give up?
I'm willing to give it up. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's for speed. And also for the books that I work on now, there are large casts of characters, and there could be 12 Transformers in one issue.
Okay.
And so when it's a meeting shot of the G.I. Joe team, and so
to help identify quicker for
streamline.
It's like when I asked for color reference from you.
Right. Exactly. Like high volume. Russ does a lot of books, so it's basically to help kind of.
Mike, chime in.
Yeah, just real quick question. Who makes the changes for the sake of efficiency? Like, for example, the transition from traditional lettering to digital lettering.
I don't know. I would say
so say that question one more time, Mike.
Who makes those choices, like the changes for efficiency, like going from traditional to digital? Like, for example, traditional lettering to traditional lettering to digital lettering.
Yeah, his name is John Nee. Let me tell you. So John Nee is the father, who I consider my father in comics. His sister Clydine Nee, who also recently passed away, my mentor and the reason I'm in comics. And John owned a company called In Color, and I got to listen to a lot of this different stuff. And this will be a more expansive one for another coloring show. But I remember it clearly when we had hand letters, everyone, whole department, and we were trying to figure out how to digitally color comics, because that was still where we had color guides. His whole job was to figure out how to make things more efficient. And there's other people in every company. And so basically the bigger companies spearheaded the transition because it was, one, they can do it in-house. They have more control. It took away FedEx. It took away, he was a very much pioneer of taking what he knew of the digital world into the print world. Because at that point, when we started comics, very little things were digital. Todd Klein, my favorite letterer of all time, it's all hand. I believe actually even Todd has learned how to do digital, and he does, a lot of his stuff digitally now. But my dream, if I was like Mark Miller and I had my own projects, where I have all the money in the world, or maybe a Robert Kirkman, I don't know, Ben, but I would hire Todd to letter on the boards because I'm a huge fan of that. But yeah, no, executives, were the ones that, really spearheaded that transition where we got rid of people who did color guides. We did rid of, letters, but I know letterers, Ben, that don't like balloon placements. They want that creativity, that freedom. Right. Have you ever ran into one, and do you just say, no, I'm doing it, this is the way we work? No, because, my approach for editing, from day one has been collaboration. And I look at, every person that's involved in the comic as a collaborator and a partner, whether it's the writer,
the artist, the colorist, or the letterer. And so when I talk to a letterer, and I always ask them what they prefer.
Okay. So
yeah, it's like, what do you prefer? And I'm pretty flexible with that.
You're not the Iron Fist of my childhood.
I am not.
I know that because I've worked with you for so often. Not only in the past, not only in the distant past or the near past, and recent future and current. Here's a fun thing that I have that I was thinking about when I was thinking about the questions for you. When we started talking about the digital transformation of the editor, whether it's the audiobooks or the PDFs, which is probably the biggest thing I see editors use is the digital markups. Do you remember when we were at Wildstorm, or even before that, and DC bought us? So we were working on Mad Magazine, and we're doing Flash animations, and we were doing all these different things, and we thought motion comics or digital comics were really the next thing. Now, digital comics are still around, but I barely hear about them. Tell me a little bit about how you're thinking at executive editor is towards digital comics. And I'm not talking about motion comics because I think that thing's out the door. I'm talking about just actual digital. What is your approach as an editor personally and as a company man towards digital comics? Like what's Skybound's policy?
Well, I don't know what our policy is specifically, because Skybound's policy is images policy. So, okay. I mean, we're an imprint of image. I'll be honest, like I do not think about digital comics much at all anymore. Okay. My job, my focus is actually in the direct market is print. It's print publishing. Now I do have a background where I've worked, I was the group editor for DC Digital at one point. I worked for a couple of years in the Bay Area for a startup called Madefire, where we were exploring, more sort of sophisticated sort of motion comics. But, the one thing that always stands out to me, at least recently, I have 3 children, 15 and below. And, their relationship with comics, printed comics, tends to skew probably like a lot of kids, which tends to be manga, or sort of like YA type content, but like stuff like webtoons and tapas and the sort of scrolling experience that's very popular that I know DC is doing now, probably Marvel as well, is very fascinating to me, and how like a kind of a completely different sort of approach to storytelling for me as like sort of an old head or whatever is in traditional publishing, to see how the kids these days have really gravitated toward,
Yeah, I mean, webtoons is huge. That whole doom scrolling of comics, whether they're high quality or low quality, because it's all over the board on webtoons. Kids, you see millions and millions of views across the world, but we say kids, but in reality, it could be a 35-year-old, long time, comic book reader, or first time who's just sitting in their bed and doom scrolling something new.
Exactly.
So it's interesting. So as an editor, you're never thinking like, I really like this book, but we want to do it, but it's not. I don't think it's print ready, so we're just going to make it digital. Like that's not even a conversation right now, at least where you're at.
No, like at times at DC, DC had a division, like I mentioned, that would do digital content and stuff. So that those kind of conversations were maybe more prevalent.
And a lot of it was for new talent, right? Like Carl was a lot of digital first things that I worked with him on, and stuff like that. Okay,
right, yeah, because like again, you're right, because it's like new talent. It was a great incubator for new talent because it didn't rely on people going to comic book shops and trying to find the content or whatever.
As soon as you paid them for the pages, there was almost no additional cost. There was no no shipping or anything, printing, things like that. Let's move topics a little bit, and let's go to, again, one of your specialties that I believe even at Wildstorm you were doing licensed properties. There's complexities and creative considerations about a licensed property. I mean, back in Wildstorm, we worked on a book called Left Behind, that had major creative considerations. With you doing Transformers and G.I. Joe, these iconic, childhood memories, that means so much to, us as older people, but also the new generation, where my 5-year-old neighbor, he's asking for Transformers, all the time. that's a big part. So the question would be, when editing those well-known franchises, how do you stay true to the source material while still introducing your fresh narrative? Like what goes on in an editorial sense?
It's a good question because, it's gonna be kind of a far, like probably reaching like response, but, and on the one hand, it really depends on the property, because I've worked on like every license almost you could imagine at some point over my career. And it always depends on, like I said, so the expectations with the partner, the length, the goal, like as a publisher. But it's, to me, the goal is always like for any story, any comic, any project is like getting to the root of the property. Like what has like driven that, fandom for so long? What is the nostalgic element that people really respond to? And obviously with G.I. Joe and Transformers, we are seeing great success on that front. And then sort of getting like, to the root of what makes those properties tick and what fans respond to, but then also, presenting it in a like kind of a fresh light or a new direction, but paying like, I don't want to say paying homage to, to the source material directly necessarily, but, basically you try to find that balance to please. I mean, you're never going to please all the fans, like all the diehard fans, but for the most part, deliver a package or a product that they enjoy, but also find a way to like, make it accessible to casual readers. So for instance,
not to have a fan service, not to have just like you want new readers. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless to it. Like you want to serve everybody. Right. With finding, so I imagine, after you're talking, your bosses say, hey, we have this awesome franchise. I think that they have a franchise before you came to Skybound?
Yes, they did. Yeah.
So they brought you in for that. So they obviously are talking to you about ideas and things like that. When you went and found a writer and an artist, what was kind of some of the things that you were looking for when it came to licensed products? So like if we're talking to artists right now, and they're listening to this and they're wondering, I would love to work on G.I. Joe. What are the attributes that I need? Or vice versa. We're actually talking to a young editor who is now getting, a licensed property. Who are you approaching first? You don't have to drop names, feel free, but like, who are you approaching first? And are you getting that person right away? Be like, oh, I'd love to do Transformers, or is it a long-winded process where it's like, no, I'm busy, and then you go to the next one? Like, what are you looking for? How are you doing it? Give us a little insight on that.
Well, always start with David Barron. I think that is the key right there to success. No, I'm just kidding. But
I agree with you.
I agree.
Can't go wrong just hiring the colorist first. So yeah.
There we go. I guess it's sort of, again, it depends on the property, because in some cases I worked on licensed content where the IP holder is like, okay, here's who we want you guys to approach, or like this kind of level. And they're always like, go get Alan Moore to, work on this video.
Mix it with Alan Moore and
do this video game thing or whatever. Yeah. And it's just, but the way I always approach stuff and how I would actually talk to a young editor, that was approaching content, would be a lot of it is your own Rolodex, your own mind for writers and artists. Again, sort of getting a sense of the property and the elements that, of what make it popular, etc. And like who's, as a writer, whose strengths lean this direction, who like has shown through the work that they have done for other publishers would be a good fit, for these characters or this universe. And same with the artists, like where their strengths lie, and it doesn't necessarily, what's been fascinating was like Transformers. The assumption is like, well, they have to like draw flawless robots or like follow, and I think what Daniel Warren Johnson showed in the first 6 issues of Transformers, and I think a big reason the success we had winning the Eisners as well is that he did like these characters in his style. He did not change his style. There is not a dictated house style that
he had emotion to what he was doing. He had sincerity to it, creativity to it.
Right.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because like, so I was the art director for the World of Warcraft TCG. We did the Walking Dead board game, Big Bang Theory party game, and we're dealing with all these different licensed properties, Lord of the Rings, all these things. It's one of those things where it gets really complex. Like Blizzard was a certain way. They needed every single one of their characters completely on model. And when I would work with the artists that I hired, some of them would feel that they were being crushed creatively. And even though they weren't, the Blizzard were just keeping their high standard. And it was my job to make sure that I've hired an artist that had the same thought, same standard.
Right.
How are you dealing with that? So when you get a temperamental colorist or a artist that you're working with that you like, how do you get them over that hurdle? Because usually it's not like a ultimatum. I'm done with this. Usually it's just a hurdle to help them keep going. What's your secret on keeping the flow going underneath a license property that might have a couple of approval hurdles?
Yeah, so I was the editor on StarCraft, so I know, I have similar experience, similar PTSD. Honestly, now obviously coming in the door, with the Energon universe and Skybound, these books were already underway when I had come on board. And so, Robert Kirkman and Sean Mack was very thoughtful in how they approached all of these titles. And, Hasbro has been a really terrific partner in, how we depict these characters and how we tell these stories. So I'll be honest with you, when I was talking, when I was interviewing for this job, one thing in the back of my head was like, oh man, I don't know. It's like, how tough is Hasbro going to be? Like, I've worked with licensors that it's like every single detail, like you said, has to be on model to the point where it can just destroy the productivity or the morale or etc. And so I was genuinely concerned on that front, because it does take a lot on the editor's side to try to, find ways to motivate creators, obviously, typically it's usually the artists and the colorists who are doing that heavy lifting because of the amount of reference and the amount of material to work from. But, we're very, very blessed in like the relationship we have, the trust that they have in what we're doing and the decisions, that we have made, from going from Daniel Warren Johnson to Jorge Corona, for instance, on Transformers. It was, just a kind of a great switch over to and allowing them to do their version of these characters versus here's a 3D model, just draw that.
So stiff and
right.
Things without emotion. No, and I really see it in the work that we've been doing together on G.I. Joe and Transformers. It's really been that way. I've worked with movies. I've worked with Capcom and Udon, like all these like. Some of them will be really hard and expect things that aren't in an artist's wheelhouse. So if you're an editor, my advice whenever I hire someone is to make sure you like their work and you're going to back it and support it, because that's kind of what I get from what you're saying. If you're not hiring the people you actually want to work, you can't just change their style because that's what the licensor wants. So you got to make sure they're on board, and it sounds like Hasbro has been amazing for you.
They have, and Dave, this really touches upon sort of what I consider like the number one rule to being a good editor. Now, I would never call myself a good editor, but I'm just not built that way. You know what I mean? But the way I look at it, and what was sort of imparted to me at a young age, it's like the real key to this job is just hire the right people.
Yeah.
Know who you're hiring, like. What the project is, have transparency, communication, and now not saying that won't go sideways, or that there aren't going to be bumps on the road, because that could always happen, especially when you're working,
that's the key to life, right? Hire the right people. If you're a writer and you're wanting to start a book, make sure you hire the right artist. Don't just hire any artist that's willing to take it. Make sure you like them, because otherwise you're just setting yourself to fail. Heck, partner in life. You can't just, say, hey, let's all, spend a lifetime together. You need to find the right, partner for that. Let's go to my favorite topic, that probably is the least favorite topic to editors, and maybe not, is pitching your stories to editors. Okay. My biggest thing is, how can we be heard as creators? Personally, I feel, as I've been writing for a while, and I feel it's almost impossible to be heard, because one of the biggest things is when an editor wants to read my stuff, they want it in finished form.
Right.
And so it's that chicken before the egg, type of thing where, well, before I can get it made, I got to get my script sold, to be made, or, you got to fund everything like that. When you get original idea at Skybound obviously is a little bit different because you're known for the creator owns at Skybound as well. But just in general, whether it's Skybound or not, how can someone be heard, not just by Ben Abernathy, but overall, the entirety of the editorials, staff in comic books?
Well, you're probably not going to like the answer. I'm sorry, viewers. The answer is there is no real easy answer. It is, it is incredibly hard to rise above, what I'll call the noise. Editors at every publisher probably get, pitches that they are, have requested, but also unsolicited pitches like constantly. And it is very difficult to, we only have so many slots available or so many opportunities, and to probably the vast majority of pitches we get don't end up going anywhere for us. And what I recommend to especially newer talent is, the end goal might be to get a job at DC or Marvel, for instance, but that's going to be near impossible unless you're making comics yourself. There are ways to make original comics. You can make your own webtoons. You can make your own web comics. Right. There are ways for you to create content, or find opportunities through Mad Cave or Image or etc. that they like smaller publishers tend to take chances on newer talent more than bigger publishers do.
Right.
And if I get a writer X sends me a proposal in January and we turn it down, and a year from now they reach out to see if they can pitch again, one of the things I ask, what have you been up to? Are you writing? Are you pitching? Or are you doing short stories and anthologies? The key is always just keep working and
keep moving, keep that moving,
finding ways. And it's not the easy answer, and I get it. And it's very frustrating. I know a lot of editors, unfortunately, don't respond to a lot of creators either.
Right. No, it's absolutely tough. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you're in it for 30 years or 2 years. It's really about catching an eye. There's also that saying where, to be a good editor, you have to be a good writer. With that thought, have you ever wrote anything yourself?
Yeah, I've actually never heard that. So, I've not written any. I have written some stuff for myself and adapted some things. When I was at Madefire, for instance, there were opportunities to write content, just basically as part of my job. Yeah. I would not encourage anyone to go look for it. I'm not going to win any awards. Yeah. But one of the things, while I might not be an award-winning writer myself, I do have a lot of ideas, and a lot of books that I have worked on or edited started basically with my own idea, where I'd be like, writer X, I really want to do a type of book like this, a little of this, a little of that, this is the sort of foundation, pitch me some ideas. In fact, one of the first books we worked on together, Team Zero, was an idea that I had pitched to Chuck Dixon, because, Seventh Samurai essentially is one of the greatest movies ever made, or The Magnificent Seven was take Team Seven, put them in World War II, which I'm a big fan of, let's get this gumbo together. And he wrote up a pitch and put together a project, got Doug on board.
The funny part is it just popped in my head. In my intro, I said Team 7. I didn't say Team 0. That's right. It was Team 0, not Team 7.
Right.
Of the fathers of Team 7.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It was like an in-canon story, and so I'll never get any writing credit, nor do I want it. My goal is I just want to make cool stuff, and I want to make comics. Maybe it's arrogant, but I also want to make comics I want to read. So it's sort of it's self-serving in that sense, but a lot of other projects as well. And then those opportunities, I'm sure I'd imagine all editors, probably to some degree have those sort of ideas, and maybe that's kind of how it's evolved too. Whereas 30 years ago, the sort of iron fist of editorial was I'm dictating this, and maybe now it's sort of contributing to the process in that sense, where it's I think this would be cool, or maybe we approach it this way, or like I said, it's part of it's editor is part of the team versus the one cracking the whip over the sled, you know what I mean, as we go through the
it's funny because going back to my saying of a good editor has to be a good writer, or a good storyteller. You're talking about the storyteller part, and maybe hold a good writer part. Maybe that's because I was an English major and you are a history major, so maybe that's the difference on that saying. But the other thing that you said, that's actually my motto on my website, is you got to make comics that you want to read. And that's a huge part of it. And so if you're an editor and you're editing books that you're not even into, you're not going to have good products either. Yeah, it's never going to be good. One of the things, and we're at the end of the rendering, but we still got more
approved
to talk to you. So we'll try to make it kind of go lightning round if that's okay, Ben.
Yeah. Okay. We'll see. Oh yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So like one of the biggest things, so all short answers, but obviously take your time. When you see a book, a creator on product, and you say, okay, there's something here. What is the average time from that initial spark that there's something there to being greenlit and published? What's the average time so people kind of understand what an editor does before a fan actually sees the book on a shelf?
Oh boy, that could vary based on the publisher for sure. But to give sort of a rough sense, not saying this is specific to Skybound or when I was at Wildstorm or DC, but typically, if you get the pitch, it's like great. Whether or not it has an artist attached, which can add some time on that sense, it depends on the greenlight process of the individual publisher. But typically, you do a P&L, like a project and loss sheet, to see what the costs will be. You try to forecast what it'll sell, assuming you get it all, like, everything dots the I's, cross the T's, you get a greenlit, and then you move forward depending on the schedule of the creators, the writer. Here's some deadlines, take that pitch or that idea, break it in typically into an outline per issue, then go to script stage, hire the artist,
Now,
so
obviously, Ben, you have to say you like it because you're a company man.
Right.
How do you like this whole profit and loss approach? Because you're not the first person that I've talked to on the publishing side of that. When you pitch something and they like it as an editor, then they give it to a whole nother group that talks about how sellable it is. Oh, we've already done a Western, or we've already done a sci-fi. We already done this. Right. And it's so bizarre to me, because to me, it's like, well, this is a good book. Right. Maybe your other Western really wasn't, or maybe your other sci-fi really wasn't, or maybe your other, spy wasn't. And yet that company's like, nah, that's not hot right now. Right. I always think like that's so counter to what comics is about, but that is the modern day reality for any big publisher.
Right. I'm so used to it that I actually, as you were saying it, like I hadn't really thought about that, because when I would pitch books at DC, I made a point of actually reaching out to, whether the people in accounting or, biz dev or business development, the other groups and stuff, to actually talk to them about the pitch itself. You know what I mean? And be like, rather than just having them review it and, do a magic 8 ball or whatever, how it would come out with their numbers. Like I always made a point of explaining it or talking about it, being like, do you have questions? And I always found that sort of personal approach, my own enthusiasm, not necessarily they'd be like, we're gonna sell 1 million copies because Ben's excited with this one, but it's, you can find ways. For the most part, most everything got approved, partly because, whether it's not the most commercial idea in the world, but there's a hook to it, or an angle, or there's something unique that, I think we can sort of sell, or, but also to some degree with, company like DC, for instance, comics are sort of like research and development a little bit for the media arm. And so, the cost or the price to create that comic, can be seen as sort of like pre-visualization development or whatever for movies or television. Not that as an editor, I don't care about that stuff. I just want to make great books. And I've had great books that I thought as a pitch that should have, gotten through greenlight didn't. I've had books that did get greenlit that I thought was the greatest idea ever that no one read.
Yeah. So but when that happens, when you have a project that you want greenlit and it doesn't, what do you do with that project? Do you tell them, hey, go to my buddy over here, like we're passing, go call this? I mean, comics is a tight world, it's a small world. You just kind of sit them on and hope that it does seem light. I mean, one of the biggest things, obviously it was a little bit different of the things, is like The Boys. The Boys was originally at, DC, then it got thrown out. Yeah.
My baby.
Yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about it if you can.
Well, I don't, don't want to dig up too many graves.
No. I mean, just in terms of use it as an educational tool for any aspiring editors. Because I want creators to kind of understand that there is more to the process than they think of showing up to a Comic-Con and saying, editor, look at my work.
Right.
And then all of a sudden it's magically, because that was the 90s. It felt like that was, how it used to be. And now everything is very much overthought.
Right. With the boys specifically. So I was the commissioning editor on the boys at Wildstorm. I was the editor on the first 6 issues that were published under, Wildstorm's signature. I think it was the signature imprint. In that sense, at a company like a company the size of DC or Marvel, probably in a similar fashion, when books get greenlit, there are a lot of cooks in that kitchen upstairs, not cooks involved directly with the creation of the book, but like you mentioned, there'll be people that are running numbers or the marketing people or, licensing people, publisher, like a lot of people that review stuff. And with the boys, it went through the green light, went through all the, the proper channels, etc. to get set up and approved as a series. We executed exactly what the book was pitched to be. We were selling well, but unfortunately in that sort of committee above our pay grade, someone had not reviewed it, then read it and did not feel it was appropriate for DC. I mean,
so already kind of had the same outcome, and so I do get it. That's why I was actually surprised the boys did get approved to begin with, because we already ran into it all the way, with authority. In some aspects, Planetary, had its troubles, slightly different execution, but still had the same troubles. We are out of time. Because I do want to, make sure I get you out. Like I said, the biggest thing that I'm curious about also for other editors is I have a problem. Maybe I'm old, or maybe it's just because I'm a creator. I don't know, but I don't really, when I see someone like you or Mike Marks or Katie Kubert, someone that's been around for a while, they tend to have different fan engagements than a lot of the young editors. And talking to young creators and old creators, there's definitely a sense that it's kind of known. What advice do you have for editors on fan engagement and creator engagement? Because obviously it's a small world, both fans and creators of the hardcores. And we want to build a positive world. With your, kind of final thought, and I'll give you a final word later after this last question. What is your, approach to fan engagement, especially with the fundamental shifts in the way comics have changed over the years in just who reads them, who makes them, and then also who engages with us? What's your advice to editors on how to deal with that?
My one advice would be to not engage typically on social media. To varying degrees, social media can be, awesome and a great way to connect and, talk about product. It can also become a black hole of negativity and sort of awfulness, which I discovered firsthand when I moved over to be the group editor for the Batman group. Found out a lot of passion on that side of things. For fan engagement, what I love to do myself, and I to varying degrees with editors, I do love talking to fans. When I went to South Africa for the convention, where I discovered, and I put it in quotes because I don't believe that editors really discover anyone, because I'm not the one drawing the comics or whatever. With Carl, it was one of the best shows I've ever been to, because it was the first time that I was put behind a table and talk to fans nonstop for the entire weekend. And I loved it. I love talking to fans. I love to, pick their brains, see what they like, see what they don't like. What do they, most of them hadn't read anything I'd worked on, but also, just kind of get a sense of what their interests are. And, I love interacting with fans. When at Wildstorm, we used to work the booth. I loved interacting and engaging with fans, with creators. So for like young editors, I would say fan interaction is great, and in person is definitely the way to go. Because again, social media, obviously, we all know the pitfalls there. With creators, my advice is always like friendly, professional. Always like I don't know, please and thank you, and communicate well. Like just present yourself in a manner that is, like I said, try to be open and friendly and but also professional in that sense. You know, I know that sometimes the lines will blur where it's like, you know, best friends or, you know what I mean? Or like,
one of the things I always tell to creators when talking to anybody is be passionate about what you do. If you're not passionate about what you do, if you're not excited to talk about what you're doing, people aren't going to really want to work with you. And I think editorial is probably the same thing. If you're an editor, you really don't want to talk to writers and artists and colorists and letterists and designers and fans. Probably editorial is not for you.
You're right. Because you're like the editor is the only consistent advocate for that project, that series from end to end. So you're right. That's like I'd mentioned when like doing green lights internally at DC. It's like my own passion. Or I will be like, I'll talk it up. I'm the hype man. I'm the one that's like the face for this. So let's go.
It's an interesting process. So the whole tagline of the show was "Who calls the shots?" I don't know if we actually figured out who calls the shots in comics. I think we've confused it a bit more in the modern days comics of who actually can greenlit your book, who can actually help you get it off the ground. But we do know that editors are a vital part of the process, a very, in my opinion, underappreciated skill, and where there's a reason why we have the Eisner for best editor, because there is a absolute reason they are so valuable, and why I appreciate a good editor. Ben, you have always known how much I appreciate you. Thank you for coming on the show. Mike, go ahead and pop in here. So I do want to thank you personally for coming on the show, your first ever. Hopefully it was a good experience, and who knows, we'll have you on in season 3 to talk something else. Leave us, Ben, before Mike and I talk. Tell us a little bit about what we saw today on Doug's work, what you're doing at Skybound, things like that, and any final words. And take it away.
Yeah, I will say I hope everyone enjoyed seeing the process on that Optimus Prime cover, because I think Doug is easily one of the top 5 my all-time favorite artists, and that guy can literally draw anything really well. And he's also probably maybe the kindest human being you might ever meet in your life. I really appreciate you guys. I feel very fortunate to come on your show and talk about, this process, because editors don't usually get asked to talk about, their craft or what they do. Editors get blamed when everything goes wrong, gets no credit or anything when there's success, which, is fine. I guess that kind of comes with the territory, but I appreciate it. And I'd love to chat more about all of this stuff. And, like Skybound, like I mentioned, we'll do the quick real plug here. I do edit the Energon universe titles, Transformers, Void Rivals, G.I. Joe monthly. I am the editor on a rotating creep show, horror anthology. And I'm very, very excited. Come July, my first Skybound original is coming from the great French creator, Ludo Lullaby. It's called Ghost Pepper, and it's going to blow everyone's minds. It is going to be awesome, and I hope people check it out. And again, let's just, like, in a world that at times seems very dark and like a borderline dystopian, let's just be good to each other and love everyone and just be positive and just support us in these hard times. Well said.
Well said. Mike?
As always, watch the process, subscribe to the Sig Slayers Station. And I must add, thanks, Ben, for joining us. You are also our first editor on the Sig Slayers Station, so it's an honor for you to be here. And I got to say, the powerhouse of penciling, Doug Mahnke, did it again with this piece. It's so awesome. Be sure to see his animations as well every Tuesday on the Sig Slayers Station.
So that is our show. Thank you so much for being with us. It meant a lot to have Ben, a longtime friend, on the show talking about his craft. If you are an aspiring editor or a writer or an artist or a creator, just know that it's a small community of people who care first and foremost about their craft. Feel free to find Ben at a show and say hi. Find me at a show or leave comments into the comment section, and we will answer them best we can. As always, thank you for watching this episode of The Process, and we'll see you next month. Thank you. Sig Slayers.